To his peers, Gerald Haidt was the quintessential invisible man of his generation, unremarkable in both appearance and character. Born in Virginia, his family relocated when he was 5, planting roots in the community that would quietly shape the rest of his life. High school offered little change. His father worked there as the senior history instructor, but even with that connection, Gerald remained on the fringes. His classmates embraced a near-zealous devotion to all things all-American: sports, pep rallies, shiny new cars. Gerald, meanwhile, spent his afternoons in front of a screen, learning his first computer inside and out, while his peers learned the feel of their first car keys. He haunted chat rooms, played online games with strangers across the globe, and steered clear of every extracurricular activity that animated the rest of the student body. To those who later heard his story, it might have sounded as if Gerald carried an air of superiority. Nothing could be further from the truth. He simply wasn't willing to risk the pain of failed connections. Every conversation replayed in his head for days, weeks, sometimes years. Every missed cue or awkward pause felt like stepping into oncoming traffic. His parents noticed. They worried over what they called his unnatural aversion to people. On one hand, they understood the shifting dangers of the world and felt reassured that Gerald was safe in his room. On the other, they feared he was quietly dismantling his ability to connect with anyone at all. They comforted themselves with the idea that it was a phase, that Gerald would grow out of it when the time came. That day never came. By senior year, Gerald Haidt had withdrawn almost completely, a recluse with no real passions beyond the endless reach of the web. Others, hearing Haidt's story, might imagine an aloof genius in the making, someone destined to thrive in an academic setting. They might picture a future where Gerald Haidt's name was spoken at every kitchen table, a man who would cure cancer or unravel some centuries-old mathematical mystery that had stumped the brightest minds. But that wasn't Gerald Haidt. Despite spending countless hours on a computer with the world's knowledge only a click away, his grades were abysmal. Rather than studying or preparing for class, Haidt spent his time scouring the internet for shortcuts and workarounds. In those days, plagiarism detection software was mostly reserved for college professors, so it was no surprise that he coasted through high school with little effort. That luck ran out when standardized testing season arrived. He failed every university entrance exam he attempted, qualifying only for the local community college. And even then, he was placed into remedial courses his first semester. Things only worsened. Haidt failed the written portion of his driver's exam, which meant his father had to drop him off on the way to his own job as a teacher. Gerald then had to linger on campus until his father could pick him up in the evening. Most days he burned with embarrassment as he waited outside the English building, knowing classmates, especially the girls from his courses, could see him hustling toward his father's aging sedan, slamming the door and snapping his seatbelt into place. More than once, they watched him shout at his father to just drive. They pitied the man behind the wheel and shook their heads as they passed. Those humiliations didn't last long. Midway through his first semester, Haidt submitted a paper flagged almost instantly by the professor's plagiarism software. Summoned to the dean's office, he was walked through the school's strict policies on academic dishonesty. Ashamed and unwilling to face his professor, Haidt simply stopped going to class. He spent the rest of the semester in the campus library, aimlessly surfing the web while the future he'd once been expected to chase slipped quietly out of reach. Technically, a student's academic record is confidential, but Haidt's mother was clever enough to make him log into the university's grading portal while she watched over his shoulder. After seeing the results of his first semester, she and his father agreed. Gerald would be withdrawn from school. Christmas came and went, as did the new year. Gerald remained at home for 2 months, slipping into a night owl existence, going to bed around 5 in the morning and waking only when his parents were starting dinner. More troubling was his growing isolation. He began taking his meals in his room, emerging only to use the bathroom. In a bid to jolt him out of his rut, his mother tried a small experiment. She stopped doing his laundry. The logic was simple. He'd be motivated to take responsibility, one baby step at a time. 2 weeks later, with the stench from Gerald's room becoming unbearable, she quietly surrendered and resumed the chore. By spring, his father decided to take matters into his own hands. Each morning at 6, he would wake Gerald and send him jogging to the local market to buy a single can of soda, which Gerald was allowed to drink with either lunch or dinner. Gerald's first act of defiance was to walk instead of jog. The next day, his father imposed a time limit on the task, making a leisurely stroll impossible. Computer access was restricted as well. Gerald could use it only to study for his driving exam. Any other online time had to be spent at the public library, twice as far as the market. During dinner, Haidt's father would quiz him on questions from the driver's manual, expecting Gerald to recite the correct answers. Over spring break, his father drove him to the testing center, and Gerald finally passed. With a license in hand, his father launched the next phase of personal growth. Gerald no longer had to wake at 6 and jog to the store. Instead, he was required to leave the house by 7 and return by afternoon with 5 completed job applications. His parents reviewed each one in the evening, sometimes even submitting extra copies themselves, suspecting Gerald might be sabotaging the process. Of all places, the first response came from the local market, and Gerald took the job. For a time, it looked as though he was finally moving in the right direction. He worked there for several weeks before his father's patience wore thin again. His father began pressing him to purchase the family's aging sedan and start living more independently. Instead, Gerald's paychecks vanished into online purchases, video games, expansion packs, and late-night delivery pizzas. When his father confronted him, the conversation quickly turned volatile. Gerald lashed out, shouting at both parents. His father shouted back. Gerald grew louder, angrier, until in a surge of rage, he hurled a lamp against the wall. Fortunately for everyone, the lamp was almost entirely metal. Only the bulb shattered, and the shade somehow remained intact. Things changed after that. Haidt's father adopted a new approach, allowing his son to make weekly payments on the family sedan until it was his. With transportation now in hand, Gerald began to thrive in unexpected ways. Within 2 weeks, he quit his job at the market and took a position at a hardware store across town. His parents were thrilled to see him navigating this new phase of life on his own. They were even more surprised when he bought a cell phone and volunteered to take full responsibility for his car insurance. The momentum continued. Gerald contacted the university and arranged to re-enroll the following year under academic probation. Officially, he was now pursuing a bachelor's degree in business. For the first time in years, it seemed like his life was finally turning around. 5 years passed, though, with little to show for them. Gerald worked shifts and attended classes, but he never formed a single meaningful friendship. Romantic relationships were just as absent, something he barely expected anymore. At 24, newly graduated, he began searching for opportunities beyond the hardware store. Nothing came close to matching the pay he earned as a shift supervisor. There were internships, but Gerald wasn't interested in starting at the bottom again. Another 3 years slipped by, his life unchanged. At 27, he began to question the point of it all. He didn't know what he wanted, or even which direction to face. He wasn't living for anything, and he believed in nothing. Time moved forward. Minutes, hours, paychecks, bills, while nothing inside him shifted. It had become a dangerous, numbing cycle. It was purely by chance that he noticed them. At first, there was only one, but soon more began to appear. What caught his attention was their strange attire, garments foreign and unfamiliar, yet their faces and voices were unmistakably American. On a whim, he followed one of them through the gardening section and watched as the stranger purchased various materials. They paid in cash and disappeared into the parking lot. It quickly became a fixation. Who were these people? What were they building? And why did they seem so happy? Their clothes were odd, but their expressions were always bright with joy. Compelled to know more, Haidt kept watching. On the day he finally worked up the nerve to follow them out into the parking lot, there were 4 of them. He lingered just far enough away to see them load their materials into a large van marked with flowing script along the side, "The Adherents of the Divine Winds." Haidt became obsessed. For weeks, he researched the group online, uncovering references to their outreach work and spiritual centers scattered across the country. He was unfamiliar with terms like Vedic tradition, guided meditation, or standardized prayers and spiritual practices. These concepts were entirely new to him. During work, he found himself sneaking into the back stockroom, phone in hand, diving deeper into his research instead of focusing on his tasks. This went on for weeks, his curiosity growing into fixation. Even as he noticed his own obsessive behavior, he tried to break the spell by looking for negative information about the group. But nothing stuck. All he found were testimonials from people who praised the group's outreach, but admitted they couldn't keep up with the rigorous spiritual practices many described as simply too time-consuming. This never bothered Haidt. More than anything, he craved personal direction, and this seemed like the only path forward. It took him nearly an hour to work up the courage to call the number listed on the group's website. A polite young woman answered. She immediately heard the panic in Haidt's voice. Most people who called were nervous, but he was far beyond that. She understood. This was the line that, for some, marked the first step toward spiritual transformation. Despite his trembling voice, Haidt scheduled an appointment to meet with a senior clergy member and tour the facility. The moment he arrived, he was captivated. The compound's immaculate grounds, the sense of order and purpose. He fell in love instantly. That first day was 3 years ago. Now, at 30, Haidt wouldn't have recognized the uncertain stranger who made that call. The timing of Haidt's conversion could not have been more pivotal for him, but things at home were unraveling. His father, never particularly religious, had begun reevaluating his beliefs after a series of severe stomach pains led to an advanced cancer diagnosis. As a history professor, his father possessed a deep knowledge of Western Christianity and eventually settled into a mainline denomination that suited his worldview and biases. That shift only deepened the rift between father and son. Haidt's conversion to what his father called a heathen religion ignited tension that neither could diffuse. Each tried to outdo the other in wisdom and piety until they stopped speaking altogether. After one brief but explosive argument, Haidt left home for good. He moved into the compound's dormitory, sold nearly everything he owned, quit his job at the hardware store, and applied to join the junior clergy. For reasons even Haidt couldn't explain, everything seemed to fall into place. A man who had never excelled in any academic discipline now found himself effortlessly rattling off various strands of Eastern religious thought and the philosophers behind them. He committed long passages from the Adherents' holy texts to memory, dialogues between saints and spiritual leaders that functioned as a kind of shorthand comparative religion course. These passages were further explained in small printed tracts, customized for potential converts depending on their religious background. Haidt might not have brought in a flood of new members, but his zeal for the faith and his willingness to take on any task set him apart. It wasn't long before he was asked to serve in missionary work in a new city. He was warned beforehand that the compound there was smaller, with far fewer converts. It was a subtle signal. He would likely spend much of his time in outreach, including manual labor, something he hadn't done in over a year. It was in this new city that Haidt met another junior clergy member, Alfonso Silva. That, of course, was his given name. Both men had adopted new names as part of their transition into the clergy. Members were not permitted to choose these names for themselves. Each was assigned by a mentor, chosen for its particular significance within the faith. Although the adherents encouraged use of these new names, they insisted they were not erasing anyone's former identity, only adding to it. Gerald Haidt became Summer Wind, a reference to the gentle, refreshing breeze described by one of the saints while proselytizing to rural Cambodians. Alfonso Silva became a child's smile, echoing an idiom the saints used for someone eager to learn with childlike enthusiasm. After completing their missionary assignments, both men were recalled home. The two became friends, though their approaches to their duties were radically different. Alfonso poured himself into the outreach programs, passionate about helping people in recovery cross the bridge from 12-step programs into life as adherents. His efforts, however, brought little success, and Haidt often worried about Alfonso's own sobriety. Haidt could never prove it, but he carried a constant suspicion that Alfonso had returned to using forbidden substances. Within the faith, it was considered improper to ask directly, but Haidt tried to probe in subtler ways. He would frequent the same neighborhoods Alfonso visited, hoping to overhear some stray remark about Alfonso's habits. Nothing ever surfaced. Haidt suspected it had something to do with his appearance. He was obviously part of some strange foreign religious movement, too clean-cut to be mistaken for someone involved in drug culture. Strangers seemed to hold their tongues in his presence. In the cosmology of the Adherents, every soul was doomed to reincarnate endlessly so long as it carried sin. But sin, in their teaching, was not the same as the Judeo-Christian concept. Adherents were instructed to stress this distinction constantly when comparing their faith to others. Sin was seen instead as a kind of cosmic debt, a balance carried forward from one life to the next. Death could pay down some of the debt, but the remaining balance determined whether a soul's next life would be easier or harder. The ultimate goal was to escape the cycle of suffering altogether and reach heaven. This was possible without becoming an adherent, but their specific practices they taught made the transition easier and accelerated the process. That state of final release had a name within their doctrine: underachieving. The adherents believed there would come a time on earth when all people would awaken to the cycle of suffering and, together, make the conscious choice to end it. Haidt had also heard whispers of the so-called deviant ones, those who understood the cycle yet worked to perpetuate it. Their motives, according to the faith, were shaped by demonic influences that feared extinction once humanity collectively achieved underachieving. More troubling was the adherents' teaching that pacts could, in theory, be struck with such forces. A person could bargain away their future, extending the cycle of suffering in exchange for heightened pleasure in their current life. In doing so, they extended the existence of the demons themselves. The faith offered no term for this dark, mutually beneficial relationship, nor did it explain how such a bargain might be made. It simply acknowledged the possibility. Whether Alfonso Silva had betrayed his vows in favor of demonic pursuits, Haidt could not say. But the circumstances of Alfonso's death gave grim weight to the suspicion. From the perspective of the faith, Alfonso had either been dangerously lax in his adherence, or had been planning betrayal all along. For the sake of Alfonso's soul, Haidt hoped it was the former. Either way, Alfonso's soul was already moving on to its next life, bound to whatever fate it had earned. As for Haidt, his task was clear. He would ensure that every trace of Alfonso Silva's connection to the Adherents remained firmly in the hands of the senior clergy. The compound maintained a small fleet of vehicles reserved exclusively for the senior clergy. Junior clergy, when sent out to proselytize or assist in the faith's many outreach programs, were either dropped off by senior members or required to walk. This rule was meant to demonstrate discipline, and it was taken seriously by all. The situation at hand was so grave that it broke protocol, placing the keys, quite literally, into the hands of a junior clergyman like Haidt. Only in rare cases had he ever been allowed to drive, most of them routine trips to or from the airport. Today's trip was something else entirely. Locally, the most senior member of the clergy was Cardinal Nguyen. His involvement in the faith was a mystery in itself. Fluent in 4 languages, he had nonetheless been transferred to what many whispered was a stagnant, even rotten assignment in the middle of the country. Nguyen always seemed occupied with something unusual. What that something was, Haidt could never say. He had habits that set him apart from others in his position. Most cardinals spent their days teaching senior clergy or making appearances alongside online personalities to promote the faith. Nguyen did his share of instructing, but far less than his peers across the nation. He never spoke with the media, never appeared on camera. Instead, he spent most of his time behind closed doors in his personal office, emerging only for the one constant in his schedule: leading the guided meditation sessions each morning. The rituals of the faith were Cardinal Nguyen's domain. He spent more time attending and leading them than any other Cardinal Haidt had ever known. Nguyen would guide the sessions and then vanish upstairs, leaving little trace of his activities. That was why Haidt was so surprised to be granted a private audience with him directly after one morning's meditation. Haidt vividly remembered following the cardinal to his private office and listening as Nguyen laid out the seriousness of the situation surrounding Alfonso Silva's death. Haidt had no reason to doubt Nguyen's motives. The cardinal spoke only of protecting the compound and, more broadly, safeguarding the faithful. The mission itself sounded simple enough. Haidt was to drive across town to the house Alfonso had rented from his parents, enter quietly, recover any materials connected to the faith, and return them directly to the cardinal. The difficulty lay in the entry. The house would almost certainly be roped off with crime scene tape, and the police might still be watching. Getting inside without drawing attention would require care and skill. Haidt didn't expect to find anything remarkable. Most junior clergy owned several handbooks, standard material outlining how to explain the complex theology of the Adherents to newcomers. The faith was scripture-based, with original texts written in both French and Vietnamese. Over the years, many concepts had been borrowed from other religions, and early saints had annotated them by hand in Vietnamese before those notes were translated into French. Eventually, an English edition appeared, produced by a member of the senior clergy whose English was rudimentary and who had never learned Vietnamese. The result was a patchwork of errors and awkward phrasing that critics of the faith love to exploit. Newer, cleaner translations were now available, but when speaking with those familiar with the sect's history, the adherents often had to defend or clarify the old wording. For that reason alone, Haidt assumed he might find a handbook or two in Alfonso's home. Nothing more, nothing less. There were other possibilities as well. Every junior clergyman went through a ceremony in which specific questions and passages were read aloud. Each prospective member received a large hardcover book outlining the stages of the elaborate rite and the passages they were required to memorize. During the ceremony, those passages were recited before an audience of aspiring clergy, senior officials, and the local cardinal. The book itself included blanks where key words had to be inserted for the passage to make sense. A member of the senior clergy would handwrite the missing words in the margins, noting the exact page and line number for reference. In the past, several recordings of these ceremonies had leaked, to the adherents' deep embarrassment. One recording contained a passage that was misinterpreted as denying the divinity of Jesus Christ, sparking public outrage. Infiltrators had even memorized certain passages well enough to fool legitimate clergymen. The scandal forced Cardinal Simmons of Sacramento to step forward, granting a full, uncensored interview broadcast live. The audience was deliberately packed with fundamentalist pastors who questioned him relentlessly, but Simmons managed to steady the storm. Weeks later, the hierarchy changed its policies. All sacred texts used in the transition from lay adherent to clergy were to be kept strictly within the compound. But no official call ever went out for previously issued materials. Many clergy simply forgot they had copies at home. It was a dangerous oversight, one the hierarchy knew it could do little to correct. Even Haidt hadn't considered that Alfonso Silva's materials might still be out there, until Cardinal Nguyen raised the concern. Haidt had no reservations about the task. In fact, a faint smile played on his lips as he drove alone across town. He located Alfonso's rental easily, but circled the block several times, looking for a discreet place to park the borrowed vehicle. Finally, he spotted the perfect spot beside a tall wooden fence draped with overgrown foliage, just 3 houses away from his target. He sat for a moment, engine off, strategizing his approach. Sure enough, bright yellow police tape stretched across the porch columns of Alfonso Silva's home. There were so many layers of tape wrapped around the entryway that the doorframe itself was barely visible. Luckily for Haidt, the rental property had a chain-link fence enclosing the backyard, something he could hop with only a little effort. He sat and thought it through while a few pedestrians drifted past on the sidewalk. Perhaps he would leave the car unlocked, step out casually, and stroll up to the fence as if he belonged there. The backyard itself was mostly hidden by large trees on the side opposite his planned entry point. The rear neighbor's tall wooden fence offered further cover. As long as no one happened to glance out a window at the wrong moment, Haidt would go unseen. The empty driveways in the neighborhood suggested this was the perfect time. After clearing the fence, all he would need to do was test the back door, or, if necessary, force open a window. Haidt leaned forward, bracing himself against the driver's side door. He shifted his weight, ready to push it open and make his move, when an elderly man suddenly appeared, shuffling past with a small dog on a leash. Startled, Haidt snapped back into his seat. His heart thudded in his chest as he watched the man and his dog continue down the sidewalk. They crossed the street and disappeared from view, but the jolt of adrenaline remained. Haidt wiped his palms on his pants and took a deep breath. That had been far too close. The old man would have seen everything if Haidt had gone over the fence a moment sooner. Haidt remained in the car for another 5 minutes, weighing his options. He considered driving back to the compound and explaining to Cardinal Nguyen that the property was too exposed, that the police presence made the task impossible. But as he imagined the conversation, a sour feeling took hold. He didn't want to lie to the Cardinal. Nguyen must have seen something in him. Why else entrust a junior clergyman with a task like this? Perhaps this was how it worked for everyone. Maybe before elevation to the senior clergy, each candidate was quietly tested. Haidt knew he wasn't eligible yet. 5 years in the junior clergy were required, and he still had several left. But a successful mission like this could only make him stand out, and Cardinal Nguyen could prove to be a powerful ally. At last, Haidt centered himself and pushed the door open. He stepped out, leaving the windows down, and strolled casually toward Alfonso's rental property. As he approached the chain-link fence, a lone car rattled by, barely slowing before turning right at the stop sign. For reasons he couldn't explain, the sight lifted his spirits. It felt like a sign that this neighborhood kept to itself, that no one would pay much attention to a man hopping a fence. Probably, he thought, no one would even notice. Haidt crossed the patchy lawn and set his hands on the bar running along the top of the chain-link fence. He hesitated, gauging the leap. The spires, where the twisted wires met, looked razor-sharp. He noticed at once that the top bar had slack. If it sagged under his weight, his arms could be sliced open. The thought drained his courage, and he began scanning the perimeter for another way in. He found it on the far side of the house. Tucked between the rental and the neighbor's wooden fence was a narrow gate. To his surprise, it wasn't locked. He slipped through, then carefully swung it shut behind him, making sure the latch clicked back into place. Haidt stepped onto the back porch and saw the bright strips of crime scene tape stretched across the door frame. He exhaled sharply, muttering a sarcastic remark under his breath, then turned to the windows. One by one, he tested them, pushing gently, hoping for any give. Every latch held firm, except for one, where a bulky air conditioning unit protruded. The unit was heavy, easily 40 pounds or more, but it was poorly secured. Haidt worked it loose, inch by inch, until the window opened far enough to slide the machine out. He set it carefully on the ground, then gripped the sill, braced himself, and hoisted his body through the narrow opening into the dark interior of the house. Haidt collapsed onto the floor and immediately sensed he had entered Alfonso Silva's bedroom. The walls were that familiar, impersonal off-white, standard for rentals before new tenants move in. The hardwood floor was bare, and the only furniture was a rolled-up futon mattress in the corner. The Adherents prided themselves on minimalism, and Haidt allowed himself a small smile. At least Alfonso, whatever his other failings, had taken that aspect of the faith to heart. Haidt pushed himself upright and began his search. He opened the bedroom closet first. Inside hung 2 junior clergyman suits, both the standard stark white. On the floor sat 2 pairs of white shoes, roughly Haidt's size. The rest of the closet was empty. He closed the door quietly and moved down the narrow hallway. The second bedroom was completely bare. A hallway closet near the bathroom held nothing but neatly folded towels. Another small closet, housing the unit's hot water heater, was equally empty. In the bathroom, he found nothing out of place: 2 bars of soap, a bottle of shampoo, conditioner, and deodorant. The medicine cabinet yielded a toothbrush, toothpaste, mouthwash, and a bottle of over-the-counter pain reliever. Nothing more. "No floss," Haidt muttered as he closed the medicine cabinet. To an outsider, it might have seemed trivial, but to the Adherents, it was no small thing. The faith's medical fund covered nearly all of the clergy's health needs. None of them carried private insurance, nor did they participate in government programs. Failing to floss, inviting preventable dental issues, was regarded as a kind of venial sin, a needless strain on the shared fund. Such a simple habit, yet such a potentially avoidable burden. Satisfied with his inspection, Haidt moved on to the kitchen and dining area. The dining room was barren, the spot where a table and chairs should have been left empty, as if no one had ever lived there. The kitchen was much the same. A few matching white plates and pieces of silverware, a refrigerator containing only a handful of sauces, and no real food. A bottle of dish soap sat by the sink, and a single plate rested upside down on a towel left to dry. The cabinets, when checked, were empty. Convinced there was nothing else to find, Haidt stepped into the living room and immediately noticed the difference. Unlike the other rooms, this one had furniture. A small coffee table stood in the center, scattered with Adherent-related printed materials. 2 books caught his eye, exactly the sort he had been searching for. He flipped through them quickly, and a folded piece of paper slipped free, fluttering to the floor. Haidt stooped to pick it up and felt a surge of satisfaction. It was one of the handwritten notes, the kind that listed the secret words and their positions within the sacred passages. Patered, smiling to himself, he scanned the rest of the room. A bookshelf stood against one wall, and near the front door sat a narrow table with a lamp in a single drawer. Haidt placed the books on top of the table, opened the drawer, and found several neat stacks of tracts, the sort recruits handed out on campuses or left in public places. He gathered the tracts and added them to the books, the beginnings of a carefully curated haul. When Haidt turned to the bookshelf, he felt suddenly overwhelmed. Not an inch of space remained on its crowded shelves. Most of the volumes were paperbacks on religious doctrines or philosophical debates. Mixed among them were a few worn novels from Alfonso's youth, along with small gifts and trinkets collected over the years, relics of another life. A magnetic calendar, a working compass, little keepsakes now forgotten. Haidt scanned quickly, eyes darting over the titles, looking for anything that might belong in his growing stash. Then something caught his attention. Beside a miniature abacus sat a figurine, the most grotesque character Haidt could imagine. It stood 4 or 5 inches tall, carved from a single piece of solid black stone. Its twisted shape and eerie contours seemed to hum with some dark history. Haidt stared, transfixed. Without realizing it, he had straightened up from his bent-over position, standing fully upright, lost in a trance. The sudden slam of a car door broke the spell. Haidt flinched and blinked hard, as though a bright light had flashed in his eyes. He rubbed at them furiously, distracted, and stepped toward the window that faced the front yard. In his daze, he moved directly into the frame, his silhouette plainly visible from outside. As his vision cleared, his heart stopped. An enormous man was crossing the yard, moving steadily toward the front door. The aging black sedan parked at the curb was no ordinary car, and the badge swinging from the man's neck confirmed Haidt's worst fear. A detective, in plain clothes, was outside, and he was investigating Alfonso Silva. He looked like a caricature straight out of a Hollywood detective flick from the 1970s. Early 60s, gray receding hair and a heavy black mustache drooping over his mouth. A massive pair of brown sunglasses obscured his eyes. As if determined to check every cliché box, he clamped an unlit cigar between his teeth and tossed his knee-length gray trench coat back into the sedan before shutting the door. His tie flapped loosely in the wind, draped over a sizable belly. Around his neck hung a harness for a digital camera, which he pulled from his shirt pocket and fiddled with, scrolling through options. Then came a flip phone from a leather holster at his hip. He scrolled through something quickly before slipping it back into place. The camera returned to his pocket. A lighter appeared in his hand, followed by the soft flick of flame as he lit the cigar and took a long drag. That's when his head tilted and he caught the silhouette in the window. Haidt froze, then panic surged through him like a jolt of electricity. He spun on his heel and bolted for the back door, leaving the books and tracts scattered behind. His shoulders slammed into the door as he fumbled with the lock, twisting and yanking in a frenzy before realizing the deadbolt was still engaged. In one frantic motion, he unlocked it and wrenched the door open, tearing through the police tape as he went. He leapt from the back porch into the yard, his feet skidding on the grass. He stumbled once, twice, catching himself just in time to break into a sprint. He reached the chain-link fence, planted a foot against it, and vaulted over. The instant his feet hit the ground on the other side, he risked a glance back. The detective was moving toward him. "Stop!" the detective shouted, breaking into an awkward run as he waddled after Haidt. Haidt didn't look back. He sprinted the three-house stretch toward his parked car, lungs burning, heart hammering. The detective gave chase, but his heavy frame and slow gait made closing the gap impossible. It didn't matter. Haidt's hands fumbled at his pocket, desperate for the car keys. He yanked them free, but they slipped from his grip and clattered into the grass beside the car. The detective was too close now. There was no time to retrieve them. Haidt abandoned the vehicle and kept running, terror ripping a ragged cry from his throat. "Don't shoot me! Please don't shoot me!" His mind turned it over and over, like decades passing across a rosary. He had failed, and he knew it. Everything was about to change. By the time the detective reached the car, Haidt had already cleared the end of the block and vanished from sight. The detective slowed, bracing one arm against the wooden fence as he caught his breath. Sweat streaked his forehead as he stared at the foliage drooping over the fence line, lost in thought. "I've got to stop smoking," he muttered, then pulled out another cigar and struck a lighter with practiced ease. When his breathing settled, he thumbed open his cell phone and called in the incident, coughing twice as he spoke. Ending the call, he bent down, studying the keys nestled among the blades of grass. A low chuckle escaped him. "What kind of moron," he murmured, "comes back to a crime scene in broad daylight?" The camera slipped from his shirt pocket, and the harness caught it just before it hit the ground. He grabbed it, switched it on, and straightened to snap a quick photo of the abandoned keys. A thin plume of smoke drifted from his lips as he took one final drag, eyes narrowing as he glanced down the street toward where the stranger had disappeared. A grin spread across his face as the distant wail of approaching sirens cut through the air.